What do exploding bottles, English glass, and widow with a drill have in common? They didn't just make champagne sparkle, they made it legendary. In this episode, I'm uncorking the true origin story of bubbles, brilliance, and a bit of chaos. Keep watching because elegance wasn't champagne's birthright, it was its battle scar. Welcome to Sip Me Maybe, the podcast about all things wine. Here we swirl, sip, and spill the truth about what's in the glass. I'm Julia, and today we're going back to where it all began. Before the glamour, before the gold labels, into a very heart, soil, and soul of Champagne. And before we begin, just a quick disclaimer. I'm not a sommelier, just a wine lover with curiosity and opinions. This is a judgment-free zone, no snobbery, no side-eye. I'll share what I'm learning, and you are always welcome to share what you know. Hit like and subscribe for more stories to come. Before the crystal flutes and red carpets, before it became a drink of celebration and seduction, champagne was a chaos in the bottle, a misunderstood wine bubbling over in the dark cellars and dismissed as the devil's work. But behind every pop, there was a story of soil, silence, rebellion, and resilience. So let's rewind the clock and trace the rise of Champagne, not just as wine, but as a legacy port. Late 1600s, a time when Champagne was still just a still wine. Quiet aging in the dark cellars with a stubborn mind of its own. Back then, the wines of Champagne weren't fizzy, festive, or designed for sabers or soirees. They were light-bodied, high-acid, often rosé tinted from short maceration. The region's cool northern climate meant grapes struggled to ripen, resulting in wines that were bright, lean, and piercing. They were bottled young, meant to refresh, not to impress. Winemakers would press and ferment their wine in the fall, then tuck it into the region's chalk cellars for winter. But here's the twist. The 1600s fell into the grip of a little ice age, Europe's coldest stretch in centuries, making winters not just cold, they were often too cold. Fermentation would stall and the yeast went dormant, leaving unfinished wine quietly slumbering in the dark. Everything seemed still until spring. When temperatures rose, the yeast woke back up, resuming its feast on the leftover sugars. And this time, it all happened inside the bottle, with nowhere for the carbon dioxide to escape. Bubbles built, pressure surged, bottles exploded. This wasn't a charming pop. This was violent. One bottle will blow, setting off others like dominoes. Entire vintages were lost. Some years, up to 90% of producers' stock was destroyed. Winemakers were so horrified, they called it Le Vin du Diable. Cellar workers began wearing iron masks and leather aprons just to survive the chaos. Exploding glass didn't care about your rosé plans. But across English Channel, something else was bubbling. In 1662, English scientist Christopher Merrett, writing from Gloucestershire, presented a paper to Royal Society that quietly shook the future of wine. In it, he described how adding sugar to finished wine before bottling could trigger second fermentation. In short, a formula for intentional sparkle. At the time, England was importing vast quantities of pale acidic still wines from Champagne and Loire, as well as light reds from Gascony. These wines, underripe and tart, by the time they arrived in London, were often dismissed by the French aristocrats as unfinished or flawed. But in England, their very leanness was an advantage. The British palate of the time had developed a fascination with brisk, slightly effervescent wines. Merchants and consumers were already experimenting with adding molasses, sugar, and spices to tweak their imported wines. Merrett's observations simply codified what was already quietly bubbling in the cellars and taverns. You could make wine sparkle on purpose, and England had an edge. Unlike the fragile wood-fired French bottles, the English used coal-fired furnaces, which produced thicker, stronger glass. Bottles that could withstand pressure. While the French were tiptoeing through minefields, the Brits were toasting bottling effervescence on purpose. Back in Auveleux, a small abbey village nested above the Marne, another kind of genius was at work. Dom Pierre Pérignon, a Benedictine cellar master, was fighting the battle of the bottle. He wasn't trying to invent champagne, he was trying to control it. He experimented with stronger glass, better fermentation practices, and what would become his legacy, masterful blending. He also addressed question of closures. Before corks, bottles were stopped with whatever was on hand. Wooden plugs, often wrapped in hemp-soaked rags, sealed with oil-soaked cloth, wax, or clay. This didn't hold pressure or preserve freshness. Some even leaked. Others simply popped off on their own. The turning point came with a natural cork, a technique borrowed from Portugal, where cork oak trees flourished. Portuguese vintners weren't making sparkling wine, but their corks, lightweight, elastic, watertight, offered a solution. When pressed into the bottle, they held tight even under pressure. Soon, those corks were tied down with hemp twine, which later evolved into a wire cage or muselet, patented in 1844. Over time, the corks themselves transformed under pressure, swelling into their now iconic mushroom shape, formed by the very bubbles they once feared. What began as a damage control in abbey cellars became a ritual of elegance. Pop, pour, repeat. But how did this devil's wine become the toast of Versailles? Simple. The court discovered it. The abbeys of Champagne were never far from the royal routes between Paris and the frontiers. Nobles traveled through the region, often visited the monasteries, tasting the local wines, trading philosophy, talking gossip. The moment they sipped champagne, especially the versions bubbling in the spring, they were enchanted. The nobility's growing affection for the wine reached the ears of Louis XIV, who had initially followed the court's preference for still Burgundy. But curiosity gave way to fascination, and fascination to favor. And it's no coincidence that shortly after Champagne gained popularity among countries, bottle transport laws were reevaluated. Until this point, shipping wine in bottles had been forbidden in France, not because of spoilage, but because of taxation. Bottles were easy to hide, barrels are bulky, branded, and taxed more easily by royal customs. Bottles could slip past inspection and move illicitly. But in 1728, King Louis XV issued an edict that changed everything. Wine could now be legally transported and sold in bottles. Seizing that opportunity, Champagne finally stepped out of the abbeys and into the marketplace. And just a year later, in 1729, Maison Ruinart was born, the first officially registered champagne house. It was founded by Nicolas Ruinart, inspired by his uncle, Dom Thierry Ruinart, a Benedictine scholar monk. Now, let's clear the fizz. Dom Thierry didn't work in the cellar with Dom Pérignon, but he lived close enough to that intellectual and religious world that his nephew could draw on the legacy. And that legacy gave Nicolas Ruinart both the confidence and the context to establish a maison dedicated solely to sparkling wine. For the first time, Champagne had both the method and the means. So while Dom Pérignon gave the wine structure and English glass gave it survival, Ruinart gave it a market. That makes 1729 the official birth year of the champagne industry. And the rest, darling, that's history in the flute. Next up, we head back to Reims, where the story didn't just ferment, it formed. Because bubbles only have the magic. The rest lives in the soil and the toit talks. Let's talk why exactly does the story begin in Reims? Because the secret sauce that birthed the sparkle in your glass isn't just about the grapes or monks or royal courts. It starts in the soil, or more specifically, the ancient chalk beds tucked beneath the cool northern hills of France. Reims isn't just the name whispered on champagne labels, it's the region's beating heart. Not Paris, not Bordeaux, here among the cathedrals, kings, and chalky cliffs. This is where champagne took roots and learned to rise. But why here? Because what lies below made all the difference. Beneath the rolling vineyards of Montagne de Reims and Côte de Blanc sits a geological marvel. Chalky limestone, the fossilized remains of prehistoric seabed that once covered this land over 70 million years ago. This chalk isn't just pretty geology, it's functional magic. It drains water like a sieve, reflects sunlight back to the vines, and acts like a natural air conditioning, keeping the roots cool during hot summer and stable through freezing winters. And when you cave into it, you get something else. Perfect cellars, deep, dark, and naturally humid. These craters, ancient Roman dark chalk pits, became the ideal aging caves for bottles of champagne. Some run 30 meters deep, with spiral staircases and arched tunnels lined with the millions of bottles quietly resting in the dark. It's no accident that the biggest champagne houses like Veuve Clicquot, Ruinart, Pommery, Taittinger, Lançon built their empires in Reims. Their bubbles may rise, but their stories are grounded in chalk. And before they were bubbles, the wines of Champagne were still pale, high acid, and nervy. The cool climate meant grapes struggled to fully ripen. The resulting wine was delicate, often rose-tinted from short maceration, and sharp enough to make you sit upright. It was elegant, yes, but austere. Think tension over texture, poise over plushness. Interestingly, Reims wasn't alone. Other regions like Loire, Alsace, and even Burgundy experienced the same springtime surprises. Bottles of still wine suddenly fermenting again as the weather warmed. But it was Champagne that didn't just endure it, it embraced it. The only region that dared to refine the accident, bottle the energy, and tame the chaos in a ceremony. So, while the bubbles may have begun by mistake, their home was no accident. This was soil built for patience, for pressure, for poetry in the bottle. And Reims itself, it wasn't just built for bottles, it was built for crowns. For over 1,000 years, French kings were crowned in Notre Dame de Reims, a towering Gothic masterpiece with rose windows and whispering vaults. To sip champagne here wasn't just a pleasure. It was a symbol of divine right and royal legitimacy. But Reims also knows what it means to fall and rise again. The city was bombed relentlessly in both world wars. Entire blocks turned to dust, and many champagne houses lost entire vintages as their cellars were looted, shelled, or drained by occupying armies. Families literally lived in their chalk cellars for years for safety, while production ground to a halt above them. Yet, like the best wines, Reims aged under pressure. It rebuilt, it reinvented, and it turned survival into sparkle. And in a twist of history, it was also here, in a modest schoolhouse turned a war room, that Germany officially surrendered to the Allies in 1945. That room still stands as Musée de la Reddition, quiet and heavy with memory. In short, Reims isn't just a place on the way to Champagne. It is Champagne. A city carved from chalk, crowned by kings, sharpened by war, and structured by bubbles. It's where cathedrals reach upward and cellars stretch below. Here, every stone, every bottle, every sip carries the weight of the centuries. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it still. History fizzing just beneath the surface. We've traced the chalk hills and limestone cellars that made Champagne soil legendary, but as much as Trois shapes the wine, it was people who shaped its destiny, and in many cases, it was women. Champagne's history isn't just about soil and grapes, it's about people, and sometimes it's about the people left behind. Let's talk about how Napoleon's law contributed to the rise of the widow-led Champagne Empire. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte introduced the Napoleonic Code, a sweeping legal framework that reshaped property rights across France and made married women legally invisible. A wife could not own land, sign contracts, or run a business. She existed in every legal sense as an extension of her husband. But if a woman was a widow, the law changed. Suddenly, she was autonomous again. And in Champagne region, where vineyards passed from one generation to the next, that loophole rewrote wine history. Her name was Barbe-Nicole Ponsardin. And when her husband François Clicquot died unexpectedly, she was just 27 years old, with a newborn daughter and faltering wine business. She could have sold the house, she could have remarried, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped into the cellar and changed everything. With mentorship from cellar master Alexandre Fourneau, she became the first woman to lead the Champagne house. But she wasn't content with survival. She wanted brilliance, both in the bottle and on the world stage. 1810, the first vintage champagne. At a time when wines were almost always behind the multiple harvests, Madame Clicquot took a radical step. She bottled a champagne made entirely from a single year's grapes. It was bold, expressive, and unmistakably hers. Here was one problem Madame Clicquot couldn't ignore: cloudy bubbles. After the second fermentation in the bottle, dead yeast cells known as lees remained suspended in the wine. The taste was perfect, the texture divine, but the look murky. Sediment swirled like snowflakes in a snow globe, although I like snow globes. Madame Clicquot didn't accept good enough. She went to her kitchen table, pulled up her sleeves, and got creative. I wonder if she was tipsy. She actually drilled holes in her own dining room table. Man, I paid so much money for mine. I would never. She inserted bottles upside down at a slight angle, and every day she gave each one a gentle quarter turn by hand, slowly guiding the lees into the neck of the bottle without disturbing the bubbles. It was one woman operation, a quiet, revelation, the birth of Riddling, or rim wash. From kitchen hack to industry standard, that kitchen table prototype evolved in what we now call the pupitre, a hinged A-frame riddling rack found in cellars across Champagne. A skilled remoire could turn up to 40,000 bottles a day, hand-rotating each one to guide the lees downward. It became an art form, ballet for the bottles. Today, most Champagne houses use gyro pallets, giant mechanical riddling machines that do the job faster. But many prestige cuvées like Bollinger, Bienvenue Française, Louis Roederer Cristal, Paul Roger, Sir Winston Churchill, Salons Blanc de Blanc, Taittinger, Comte de Champagne, and Piaget, Belle Époque are still riddled by hand out of respect for craft and clarity. Why? Because riddling doesn't just clarify the wine, it preserves the mousse. Filter it too early and you lose the texture. Skip it altogether and you're pouring yeast into someone's flute. So yes, next time you hold a crystal clear glass of champagne, thank the widow, the drill, and the pour table. 1818, the first blended rosé champagne. While pink wine existed in Champagne, through skin contact with red grapes, Madame Clicquot created the first blended rosé champagne, adding still red Pinot Noir directly into the wine. It was bold, structured, unapologetically elegant, and remains the method used by most houses to this day. But the innovations weren't just visual, they were temporal. To ensure consistency from one year to the next, Madame Clicquot and her contemporaries began keeping small amounts of wine from previous harvests. These reserved wines allowed them to craft a house style that remained reliable even in difficult vintages. This laid the foundation for what we now know as non-vintage champagne, a blend of grapes, years, and crus that expresses not just a place but a philosophy. In short, reserve wines are finished still wines from earlier harvests, kept in tanks, barrels, or even magnums under cork. When blending a new vintage, winemakers add measured portion of those older wines to give depth, maturity, and consistency, ensuring the house style remains recognizable year after year. Some houses like Krug blend over 120 different wines from more than 10 vintages. Others like Salon swing the other way, bottling only one finest year from a single village with a single grape. Different methods, one mission: to let the time speak through the glass. While Napoleon's law limited women in life, they accidentally elevated them in widowhood. And while this was complicated trade, they also created opportunities. In 1814, with Europe in turmoil, Madame Clicquot secretly shipped 10,000 bottles of champagne to Russia, smuggling them through war zones and blockades. She timed the arrival with the end of Napoleonic Wars. It worked. Tsar Alexander declared it his favorite. Veuve Clicquot became the champagne of emperors. Madame Clicquot gave champagne clarity, confidence, and signature style. But innovation alone doesn't conquer the world. To turn sparkle into empire, another house had to step in. If Veuve Clicquot taught the world how to polish champagne, Moët and Chandon taught it how to project. Scale, glamour, global domination, one glittering bottle at a time. After the widow revolutionized how champagne looked, Moët revolutionized how it moved. Founded in 1743 by Claude Moët, the house began humbly but with ambition. Claude wasn't content with just supplying local nobility. He wanted to export sparkle. He built relationships with merchants, diplomats, and even Madame de Pompadour, chief mistress of Louis XV, who famously declared, "Champagne is the only wine that leaves a woman beautiful after drinking it." By the late 1700s, Moët was supplying champagne to the French royal court, and by the early 1800s, the house had become an imperial favorite. In fact, when Napoleon Bonaparte visited Epernay, he often stayed at the Moët estate. Legend says he took cases of champagne with him to the battlefield and rewarded his host with the Légion d'honneur, France's highest decoration. The same sense of showmanship would become Moët's legacy. By the time the 19th century became the 20th, Moët and Chandon had scaled like no other. Today, it reigns as the largest champagne house in the world, with over 1,200 hectares of vineyard, many in Grand and Premier Cru villages. Cellars stretching 28 kilometers beneath Epernay, so vast they have street names. More than 28 million bottles produced annually. Moët and Chandon made champagne accessible, not just aspirational. It showed the world the bubbles weren't just for royalty, they were for parties, premieres, and the pop of possibility. In 1936, Moët added a jewel to its crown, Dom Pérignon. Its prestige cuvée, named after the Benedictine monk, often credited with inventing champagne. But Dom Pérignon isn't just a name, it's a philosophy, only made in declared vintage years, aged on lease for a minimum of 7 years, and crafted with a painter's eye for balance, ageability, and evolution. Every vintage is re-released multiple times, known as plenitudes, showing how the wine changes over decades. Dom Pérignon doesn't just ask you to sip, it invites you to age with it. First release, 7 to 9 years aging. Second plenitude, 15 years aging. Final plenitude, quarter of a century. Think about it. Moët and Chandon is now part of LVMH, the luxury juggernaut behind the Louis Vuitton, Dior, Fendi, Hennessy, and more. In fact, the M in LVMH stands for Moët. With the kind of marketing muscle that can drop a bottle on Beyoncé's yacht and still have stock for the Oscars, Moët doesn't just sell wine, it sells status. From royal weddings to runway shows, tennis finals to New Year's Eve countdown, Moët and Chandon has become the champagne of the moment, whatever that moment is. What Veuve Clicquot did for clarity, Moët did for visibility. It turned the region of farmers into a symbol of French luxury and turned a bottle into a ticket to the big leagues. So yes, while you're sipping that elegantly foamed fluid, remember, behind the gold label is 3 centuries of charm, calculation, and cultural power. From Madame de Pompadour to the Met Gala. And Moët, it didn't just follow the fizz, it built the stage for it. The next chapter of Champagne isn't louder, it's truer. After centuries of grandeur, the most exciting bubbles today are bubbling up from something more personal. Purpose, place, and people. Take Carole Duval-Leroy, for example, a trailblazer, CEO, and the first woman to lead the Champagne Wine Growers Association. Under her, Duval-Leroy became one of the first houses to embrace organic viticulture, solar-powered cellars, and zero herbicides policies. Long before sustainability was a marketing buzzword, her wines prove that eco-consciousness and elegance don't just coexist, they enhance each other. And then there are the revivalists, houses like Drapier or La Reine Frère. Digging deep into Champagne's forgotten lineage, they're bringing back near extinct grapes like Abon, Petit Mulier, and Pinot Blanc. Not for novelty's sake, but because these ancient varieties offer natural acidity and resilience in changing climate. What once survived frost and Phylloxera might just outlast heat waves and drought. But the real quiet revolution is spelled RM. RM stands for Récoltant Manipulant, or as we say in plain French, grower champagne. That means that people who grow the grapes also make the wine. No mass blending, no anonymous vats, just estate-grown Terroir First Champagne, bottled with a return address. Grower champagnes are hyper-local, often from just few hectares and crafted with minimal intervention. They're earthy, expressive, and sometimes a little wild, but always honest. It's champagne that lets the soil speak, not the PR department. And yes, they're finally landing into your local wine shops and even Whole Foods. Some grower names worth seeking out in US, and yes, a few are Whole Foods friendly. Champagnes worth seeking out include Pierre Pérignon Fils, La Red Frère, Drapier, Marget, and Jean Bessay. And then there's Jacques Lesseigneur, Vete Sorbet, Ulysse Coulon, teeny producers with cult following and teeny allocations. You won't find them at the grocery store, but if you do, grab two. And since we're uncorking the subject of hidden gems like grower champagne, let me share another secret most people overlook. Champagne has its own secret language. 2 little letters on the label that tell the whole story. Sometimes they're spelled out, sometimes just whispered in code. But once you know them, you'll never look at the bottle the same way again. A quick decoder for champagne labels. Because not every bottle comes from the same kind of producer. Here's how to read the fine print. NM, Négociant Manipulant, the big houses. They may grow some grapes, but also buy fruit from dozens or hundreds growers. RM, Récoltant Manipulant, the growers who farm their own land and bottle under their own name. CM, Coopérative Manipulant, groups of growers pooling resources to make wine under the shared label. SR, Société de Récoltants, family-owned groups of growers who make and sell wine together, often siblings or cousins. Think champagnes like J. Lassan, run by 3 generations of women, all within the same family. And last but not least, Propriétaire Manipulant, not an official legal category, but proudly displayed by producers who want you to know they own the land outright, not just renting or sourcing fruit. Think Aigli Aurier or Gratio Pilier. So while prestige houses project champagne onto the world stage, these codes are sometimes those extra words remind you exactly who's in charge of the vineyard, the cellar, and the story behind your glass.